Hello, everyone. This is going to be 19.2, getting into World War One. So let's start with a quote from Woodrow Wilson from his declaration of war in 1917, where he said, "It is a fearful thing to lead this great, peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars, civilization itself seeming to be in the balance, but the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest to our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority and to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for a universal dominion of right by such a concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and safety to all nations and make the world itself at last free." He gave this in 1917, and he's already coming in with a lot of the things that are going to be part of what are called his 14 points. So let's look at America and the war, sometimes called the Great War, World War One. The First World War came about for a lot of reasons, so let's look at what happened before America actually got into it as well. One of the biggest reasons was that there's a lot of mistrust and a lot of just general competition between a lot of the great powers in Europe and Asia and the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. And this led to a lot of increased colonialism and fighting over colonies, and each country trying to sort of out expand the others. We also see a rise in nationalism during this time, each country believing they're the top dog and wanting to prove it. And this idea of your country's superiority led to a lot of contempt for enemy countries. We also see that new technologies are coming about during this time, which means that militarism, this sort of fanaticism about growing your military, is also on the rise, and these new militaries are going to be more deadly than ever during this time. However, the moment that really started the First World War was the assassination of an archduke. There was a big, pile of tinder ready to blow up, but this was the spark that lit the flame. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, and he was killed in Sarajevo by a group of Serbian nationalists. We'll look at that more in class. And the other thing that really started World War One was allies. Most of the great powers of Europe and Asia had allied with each other. So when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia to avenge their fallen archduke, their allies lined up on either side. So suddenly we've got a multitude of different countries joining together to fight each other. This led to a huge amount of slaughter, unseen before this time period in this way. So here is the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. Both were killed in Sarajevo on that day. And here is World War One in Europe. So we see the Allied powers in green, the Central powers in orange, and neutral countries in pink. Not in this is Japan, which is a member of the Allied countries. And where is America going to fall? Well, we'll get to that in just a minute. Now, we see new technology during this time: airplanes, submarines, machine guns, flamethrowers, poison gas. And killing was made a lot easier by all of these things, not helped by the fact that we're still seeing people line up in lines and charge towards the enemy like this is, the American Revolution, and hoping to win battles that way, not realizing that we're fighting a 20th century war now with 20th century machine guns. Trench warfare led to suicidal frontal attacks where hundreds of thousands of people died, including at the Battle of Verdun, where more soldiers died in that one battle. Of course, this battle took place over like 5 months. Than in the entirety of the 4 years of the American Civil War. By the end of World War One, over 10 million people had died. So this is what trench warfare looked like. If you're lucky, this is a good-looking trench. Some bad-looking trenches are much worse than this. And this is what you ran out and charged into, what is called no man's land. And you can see that bullets flying back and forth have basically ripped this area to shreds. And we're going to see in class, you can still see the devastation of the war even in 21st century Europe. Now, America was on the sidelines, at least at first, during this war. We were divided in many ways. Many Americans, especially British Americans, wanted to side with the Allied powers like Britain. They saw also many saw England as the most democratic choice. However, there were also a lot of German Americans in America as well, and they maybe sided with the Central Powers, with their home country of Germany. There are also other groups like the Irish Americans who did not want to side with England because of their anti British feelings. And Britain was also allied with Russia, and Russia went against this whole ideal of, if we side with the Allies, we're siding with democracy, because Russia at that time was very anti democratic, very authoritarian, very autocratic. And one of the harshest governments in Europe. And many Russian immigrants, especially Russian Jews who had fled from Russia or were pushed out of Russia, saw this as going to war for the enemy, basically, which is the Russians. Now, when the war broke out in 1914, Woodrow Wilson declared American neutrality, saying he would not fight for either side. Problem is, this makes American ships a target for both sides. Britain was blockading German ports and would stop and search American ships, and also German U-boat submarines, at first at least, attacked our American ships when they were coming into British ports. And this was not just military ships as well. This was also private passenger ships. Some passenger ships were heard to have been smuggling weapons to Britain, and so the German U-boats attacked them all, including in 1915 the British ship, the Lusitania, which was basically a cruise ship, was attacked and sunk with over 1,200, almost 1,200 passengers lost, including 124 Americans. This nearly got America into the war at that time. So here's what a German Unterseeboot, or U-boat, looked like at that time: an underwater boat, a submarine. And this is the last known photo of the Lusitania. The Lusitania, like I said, was British and was torpedoed near Ireland. In response to the deaths aboard the Lusitania, Wilson sent a very strongly worded letter, strong enough that his Secretary of State resigned, thinking that it was going to get America into the war. Pacifists were worried that he was setting us up to get into the war. Meanwhile, supporters of war, like, of course, Teddy Roosevelt, naturally, believed that he was going soft, that he was being a wuss, that he wasn't going after the Germans. However, in the years before America joining the war, Wilson was also getting prepared for the chance of it. He was increasing the size of our army and our navy. This is known as preparedness. So, Roosevelt, one time of Wilson, said that he is a shifty, adroit, and selfish logothete in the White House. If you're going to insult somebody, at least do it with a little bit of class. Now, the election of 1916 was a very, very close election, perhaps showing that America was very divided during this time on issues like the war. Wilson won re-election in 1916, claiming that his preparedness had led to Germany no longer attacking us. He also claimed that "he kept us out of war" was one of his big slogans, and that came back to haunt him about 2 minutes after the election was over. Wilson beat a guy named Charles Evans Hughes by only a few electoral and popular votes. However, pretty quickly after he was inaugurated, Wilson began calling for revisions of how Europe should look after the war was over. He wanted to legit use this war as a way to spread democratic values and to change the face of the world after the war was over. He also wanted things like freedoms of the seas and restrictions on countries arming themselves. And very quickly after this, Germany started to attack our ships again. So here is Wilson on joining the war. At one point, he said, "There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. There is such a thing as a nation being so right that it does not need to convince others by force that it is right." And as we see by this button over here, he ran for re-election in 1916 on the oath of "He has kept us out of war." Now, things very quickly started to come in that forced us into the war. First of all, the British had intercepted a telegram from Arthur Zimmermann, who was a German diplomat. The Germans sent this telegram to Mexico, promising that if they supported Germany in a war against the United States, which they said was coming soon, then the Mexicans would get their territory back that they lost in the Mexican American War. They'd get back Texas and New Mexico and places like that. And this looked like Germany was planning on attacking us in secret. It looked very much like dirty warfare, this Zimmermann note. It also came out right as the Russians dropped out of the war thanks to the Russian Revolution going on in 1917. This made it easier for America to justify joining the war on England's side, saying, like, well, we're not fighting with Russia anymore. And so on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson went before Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Germany, and it was not entirely, but very overwhelmingly approved by both the House and the Senate. So here is the Zimmermann note, which, as we can see here, it's basically saying you get Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona back if you help us out. And here is Wilson speaking before Congress in April that day when they voted for the war. Now, Wilson, like I said, had a vision for Europe and Asia and basically the world after the war. And it was not one shared by the rest of the world. Unfortunately, the rest of the world was not interested in his what became known as the 14 points. And this is seen in how there had been a lot of secret treaties that kind of carved up a lot of the world after the war was over between the victorious, what would be victorious Allied countries eventually. They're planning on carving up the world into colonies and territories, especially the Middle East really gets carved up badly at this time. Wilson had hoped for decolonization at the end. In January of 1918, Wilson released his own goals for what the world should look like after the war, known as his 14 points. And these are important. Some of these are, he wanted big democratic ideas like, self-determination, freedom in the seas, free trade, an end to these kind of secret treaties that had come back to bite him. He also wanted to give colonies more rights to rule themselves and also had specific points that would help specific goals for specific countries. But lastly, and most importantly to Wilson, is the assembly and creation of a group of countries that would join together to make sure that this sort of war would never happen again. This became known as the League of Nations after the war, and it was unsuccessful, but he had the idea that we can stop this kind of war from happening again. He did have very big democratic ideas for how to stop this sort of war again. So here are Wilson's 14 points in short, including, we see things here like, the big ones at the top, and then down at the bottom we see smaller ones like redrawing France, redrawing Italy, redrawing Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and independent Poland, but down at the bottom, the creation of this League of Nations. And here is a political cartoon asking, can Wilson produce harmony between all the different worlds? Militarily, the arrival of America really helped to break the stalemate. The Allies now had more manpower and more firepower and more money than the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians did. This helped to push back a German offensive near Paris. We also saw the Meuse-Argonne offensive in September of 1918, where 1.2 American soldiers helped push back the Germans out of France. They are under the leadership of a Missourian named John J. Pershing. There were over 100,000 American deaths or injuries from this offensive. Soon after this, the Kaiser of Germany abdicated. He left the throne, and Germany very quickly sued for peace. In the end, however, over 100,000 Americans died in World War I, making up only 1% of the 10 million soldiers who died in this war. So here is the Western Front, where you can see that we are in the Allied victory of the Meuse-Argonne down there near the Argonne Forest in France at that time. And here is John J. Blackjack Pershing, who once said the deadliest weapon in the world is a Marine and his rifle. And he is from Missouri, so if you're ever wondering why we have a Pershing Avenue in St. Louis, he is the reason why. We'll also talk about what that avenue used to be called in a little bit in class. So let's look a lot at the war at home now. This is the big impact that it had was at home. One of the weird things was the progressives and the war. Many would assume that progressives would be anti-war. However, there are many who supported the idea of Americans' involvement, believing that increasing American firepower around the world is also going to increase Americans' values around the world. Many also believe that if they supported the war, there's a better chance that they would be listened to for what they wanted to change at home. So progressives supporting the war included a lot of labor leaders, intellectuals, even some, though not all, socialists, including Samuel Gompers, the head of the American Federation of Labor, muckraker Upton Sinclair, Florence Kelley, and many others who we've talked about before. Now, the First World War also increased the power of the national government, not forever, but for the selective amount of time. So, for instance, they passed the Selective Service Act of 1917. This required all men of fighting age to register for the draft, if not go over and fight. Our army grew to 5 million during this time. Men like Teddy Roosevelt really rallied young men to join this fight, including he put his sons in the war, and one of them died after his plane was shot down. And many other progressives followed this lead as well. Wilson also created the War Industries Board that only lasted for 2 years, but it regulated the distribution of raw materials, it oversaw the prices of manufactured goods, basically made sure things didn't get too expensive during the war, and it handled costs of making things for the war. It generally handled all elements of war production. The guy behind this was a Wall Street guy by the name of Bernard Baruch. And this was, however, split into many departments, including railroad administration, fuel agency, many more. And most famously, they were in charge of food. The Food Administration not only taught farmers how to make food better, but also they rationed food and they sent a lot of this food overseas. This was run by Herbert Hoover, who got a lot of good press for basically saving the country of Belgium from starvation during the war. So here's Bernard Baruch, who said, "Every man has a right to his own opinion, but to no man has a right to be wrong in his facts." So here's a World War I food propaganda, not the only one we're going to look at. Food is ammunition, don't waste it. Now, the board tried to get government and big businesses and labor to sort of shake hands and make up and work together. They made sure that the businesses would be well paid for the stuff they made. They made sure that workers would get at least a minimum wage, which is seen during this time. We see the rise of the national 8-hour workday, and also there were unions who were willing to work with them. That helped keep the labor unions happy, but also unions sort of promised that they wouldn't strike during this time, too. We also see that the progressive income tax is becoming very progressive during this time, with the wealthiest Americans paying as much as 60% of their income towards taxes, most of which was going towards the war. The board also called on regular Americans to buy what were called Liberty Bonds, donating their money to the war effort with the guarantee of being paid back with interest. But that was not the important part. It wasn't about getting paid back later, it was about the fact that you were being patriotic, that you were showing your support for the war. So here is another propaganda poster calling for people to donate tin to the War Production Board. Now, as we've seen, propaganda was a big part of this war. The federal government was in charge of propaganda during this time. Now, there were some socialists who stayed against the war despite their leaders joining the war effort. And in response to this anti war sentiment, Wilson created the Committee on Public Information, or CPI, which was basically in charge of supporting the government stance on the war. They used pamphlets, they sent out a bunch of what were called 4-minute men to give these little 4-minute speeches praising the government and the war and drawing up support for the war in a variety of languages, by the way. This was trying to get all the immigrants on our side, too. They gave out, as we've seen, a lot of propaganda posters, and they also started to create movies. This is the first time we use this to sway people in support of the war. We would see the government in charge of all of this later on, both in war and peace times down the road. World War II, the Cold War, the War on Terror, etc., etc. So here is the front of a sheet music called Over There. This is a famous World War I propaganda song done by George M. Cohen, who is also a Broadway singer and dancer and entrepreneur and the writer of the song Yankee Doodle Dandy as well. Here is another propaganda poster, Enlist, asking, which side of the window are you? And here is an um, anti-conscientious objector propaganda piece showing the conscientious objectors as not being manly enough, basically, to fight on the front lines. And here's the last one. We're going to get to a few more, but here is one showing how how to get men to enlist in the war. Is that the best way is to say that women will like you if you join the war. Gee, I wish I were a man. I'd join the Navy. So while abroad, America was promoting self-determination for a lot of the downtrodden groups, in America, propaganda was speaking in terms of democracy and how the war would improve things like the lives of workers. Very bread and butter kind of topics. Many posters also highlighted the Statue of Liberty as a way to promote the cause of liberty. Wartime propaganda also generally showed Germans in a very bad light, and this unfortunately led to a lot of anti German propaganda. We will get to this later on in this chapter, especially since St. Louis has a very German uh, uh, population during this time, and we're going to see this led to a lot of anti German feelings, especially in St. Louis. So here's just one example of anti German propaganda showing the Germans as apes, saying, destroy this mad brute. Now, since Wilson was promoting democracy abroad, many groups were calling for more of it at home, too. Before the war, many women's rights activists were against the war. However, once America joined, many women's rights activists joined, joined the wartime propaganda or joined the wartime effort. Women did things like selling war bonds, they organized rallies, they worked overseas as nurses and clerical workers, and also women were especially useful and helpful in replacing men in the factories. The men went off to fight, somebody's got to replace them in the factories. This is not just a World War II Rosie the Riveter thing, this is a World War I thing as well, as we can see here. For every fighter, a woman worker. Now, many women's rights activists hoped that supporting and serving in the wartime effort would lead to expansion of women's rights at home, especially the right to vote. However, other women were basically using this as a chance to protest, saying, look, you're not doing your part. Women are supporting the war. You need to support us more. One of the most famous examples of this is the National Women's Party led by Alice Paul. They protested and picketed and literally chained themselves to the gates of the White House to protest and publicly embarrass Wilson and basically try to light a fire under him a little bit. When Alice Paul and her allies got arrested, these are usually middle to upper class women. They chose jail over fines, and they went on hunger strikes in jail, leading to force feeding, and this was very bad press for Wilson, and so this sort of helped push him towards the idea of women getting the right to vote. So here are some women protesting outside the White House saying, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? And here's Alice Paul, 1885 to 1977. She is from New Jersey, where she was a suffragist. She was, like I said, very often frequently jailed for protesting, especially if foreign dignitaries were coming over, because she knew that would look bad. She lived a good long life, though, and she unsuccessfully worked to try to pass the Equal Rights Amendment for women in the 1960s and 70s as well. And while Wilson had very hesitantly endorsed women's rights before this, he became much more ardent and outspoken for women's rights after the war. This led to the 19th Amendment, of course, in 1920, giving the women a right to vote in every state, regardless of sex. Basically, women, all people have the right to vote. The 19th Amendment is directly attributed by many people to what women did during World War I, and that Wilson could no longer back away from it. So here is a political cartoon showing the idea that women's rights is blossoming around the country. And it is about time, so says Evil Beaver. Even he believes that it's about time. Now, another progressive group that saw a large upsurge during this time were people trying to prohibit alcohol, prohibition. The war gave prohibition an edge because a lot of beer manufacturers were German American, and so beer became seen as sort of anti American in a way. It made drinking seem unpatriotic. Also, according to people who didn't like drinking, it was a waste of wheat. You know, people are starving to death. We don't want to use wheat to make beer. And so in 1917, Congress passed the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture and sale of alcohol. It didn't become law until 1920 when they got enough states to ratify it, and it lasted until the 21st Amendment, which was passed in 1933, got rid of prohibition. So it's about time? Anyway, the First World War also heightened or highlighted this very dangerous balance. Think back to like the American Revolution. Think back to the Civil War, uh, of our liberties versus our security. So the right to freedom of speech versus the right or the necessity for America to survive. And so many saw a repression of civil liberties during this time, a rise in attacks on dissent being seen not just as an opposition, but as unpatriotic. And in the eyes of Wilson and many supporters, being against the war and its goals was to be against America. So we saw this put into law with things like the Espionage Act of 1917, which prohibited spying, but also said that false statements are illegal, and false statements could really mean whatever they wanted it to mean. This allowed guys like the Postmaster General to restrict the writings of anti-war groups and many socialist groups that were being handed out through the mail. Now, while it was seen as necessary by many as sort of a for the greater good sort of situation, and for the security of America, many people were worried that we were gaining security by losing our freedoms. So here is a political cartoon where the espionage bill is literally whipping liberty out of Congress. Now, the Sedition Act of 1918 made it illegal to even criticize the U.S. government, to criticize our democracy, or to interfere in any way with the war effort, and that is just vague enough to work. It's so vague that it can mean basically whatever they want it to mean. In the end, over 2,000 people were charged under this act, and over half of them were sent to jail, ranging from well known people to just regular Joes on the street who made public comments against the war on like a bus. Most famous was Eugene Debs, who we've mentioned several times before. Debs was a socialist leader, and he was arrested and jailed for giving an anti war speech. Debs used this trial as basically a pulpit to decry the restriction of American civil liberties. He even ran for president from his jail cell. He lost, but he got almost 1 million votes, and he was later released in 1921, even though he was sent to jail for 10 years. So here's another political cartoon showing the sedition law passing in the background, but we see that it's a chance for a roundup. Uncle Sam kicking out an International Worker of the World guy down there on the left, traitors, spies, Sinn Féin, the Irish terrorist group known as that time. Now, state and even non governmental groups also cracked down on dissent during this time. We see devotion to our flag sort of became a litmus test. Dissenters were actually forced to kiss the flag in public. Those who didn't could be jailed. We also see flags in red and black, the colors of socialism and anarchy, were banned during this time in over 20 states. Groups like the American Protective League investigated people who wouldn't buy Liberty Bond, and people informed towards the government on people that they suspected of being disloyal. This led to a lot of raids where men were even stopped on the street and forced to show that they were members of the draft, or members of the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, or the Wobblies, who were considered more of a they were seen as sort of the bad socialist group, were charged with crimes, and one of their leaders was actually lynched too. So we see that there's a lot of anti-American rhetoric and propaganda and fear during this time as well.